Judge Harrison Montgomery banged his gavel 3 times, the sound cutting through courtroom 12 of the Los Angeles Federal Building. "The court is now in session," he announced, his voice as dry as desert sand. "Case number 2025 CV 4281, Streep versus Paramount Pictures." Judge Montgomery had spent 25 years on the bench. In that time, he'd seen it all. Hollywood executives, tech billionaires, desperate starlets. None of them impressed him. So when Meryl Streep walked into his courtroom without a lawyer by her side, he couldn't help the tiny smirk that formed on his lips. Another celebrity who thought rules didn't apply to them. "Miss Streep," he said, glancing down at his papers, "my records show you're representing yourself today. Is that correct?" Meryl stood wearing a simple grey suit, her silver hair framing her face. "Yes, Your Honor." A whisper ran through the courtroom. Even the court reporter raised her eyebrows. Judge Montgomery sighed audibly. "Bold choice," he remarked dryly. "Well, let's not waste time. Opening statements, please. Paramount, you're up first." Victoria Chambers, Paramount's lead attorney, approached the bench. She was tall and polished in an expensive black suit, with sleek blonde hair and glasses that probably cost more than most people's rent. "Your Honor," Chambers began, "this case is quite simple. Ms. Streep claims Paramount Pictures stole her screenplay. We did not. The similarities between her work and our film project, The Justice, are minimal and coincidental. By the end of this trial, the facts will speak for themselves." Judge Montgomery nodded. "Thank you, Ms. Chambers. Ms. Streep, your opening statement." Meryl walked to the front of the courtroom. She pulled some wrinkled papers from a folder and dropped one as she bent to pick it up. Someone in the gallery chuckled. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quieter than expected from a woman known for commanding the screen, "I'm here because Paramount Pictures stole my screenplay about a female Supreme Court justice." She shuffled her papers, losing her place. "The screenplay in question contains unique elements that— I'm sorry, I have some notes somewhere." Judge Montgomery couldn't help himself. A small laugh escaped his lips. "Ms. Streep," he said, "this isn't an audition. In my courtroom, we follow proper legal procedure. Do you have your evidence organized and ready to present?" "I think so, Your Honor," she replied, still shuffling papers. The gallery erupted in ambiance laughter. Even the bailiff cracked a smile. Judge Montgomery raised his hand for quiet, but his eyes sparkled with amusement. He'd seen this before. Celebrities thinking they could wing it in court without proper preparation. From the plaintiff's table, Victoria Chambers shot Streep a look of smug satisfaction. This was going to be easier than she thought. In the gallery, a young Asian woman with short black hair watched with growing concern. Emma Chen, Streep's writing partner, twisted her hands nervously in her lap. This wasn't going as planned. "Perhaps," Judge Montgomery suggested, not unkindly, "you should have hired an attorney, Ms. Streep. Entertainment law is complicated. It's not something most people can handle without legal training." "I'll manage, Your Honor," Meryl replied, finally organizing her papers. "Very well," the judge said. "Paramount, please present your case." As Chambers approached with her team of 3 assistants wheeling carefully organized evidence boxes, Judge Montgomery leaned back in his chair. He caught the eye of his clerk and gave a tiny eye roll. The clerk smiled back knowingly. Chambers set up a sleek digital presentation. "Your Honor, if I may proceed." He nodded. The courtroom lights dimmed, and a crystal-clear slide appeared on the screen. Paramount Pictures began developing The Justice in June 2024, Chambers began. "As you can see from our development timeline, this was months before Ms. Streep claims to have submitted her screenplay to us." Judge Montgomery listened attentively, occasionally glancing at Streep. She was taking notes, her face giving nothing away. "Ms. Streep's screenplay was received in October 2024, Chambers continued. "By then, our project was already well into development. The timeline alone disproves her claim." Throughout the presentation, Streep remained oddly calm. Once, Judge Montgomery caught her staring at a seemingly random point on the courtroom wall. Was she even paying attention? "Miss Streep," he interrupted, "are you with us?" "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, blinking as if returning from deep thought. "Good, because I won't have you wasting this court's time if you're not taking these proceedings." "Seriously?" Streep's face reddened slightly, but she nodded. As the morning session continued, Judge Montgomery found himself increasingly irritated by Streep's casual approach. When she finally objected to something, her argument was so poorly framed that he had to cut her off. "Ms. Streep, that's not how hearsay works," he explained with thinly veiled impatience. "Perhaps you could benefit from Legal Procedure 101. The courtroom tittered again. Little did Judge Montgomery know that the acclaimed actress sitting before him wasn't nearly as unprepared as she seemed. Behind her fumbling exterior and messy papers, Meryl Streep was setting a trap that would soon leave everyone in the courtroom, including him, completely stunned. Victoria Chambers concluded her opening presentation with confidence. "Your Honor, these development documents clearly show our project was well underway before we ever received Mrs. Streep's submission. Any similarities are purely coincidental." Judge Montgomery nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Ms. Chambers. Ms. Streep, do you have any questions at this time?" Meryl stood, dropping her pen in the process. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm wondering if Paramount could clarify." She paused, seemingly losing her train of thought. A few more chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Judge Montgomery sighed. This was going to be a long trial. 6 months earlier, the writing studio hummed with creative energy. Afternoon sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating the space where Meryl Streep and Emma Chen sat surrounded by research materials, empty coffee cups, and notebooks filled with ideas. "That's it," Meryl said, typing the final words on her laptop. "We've done it, Emma." Emma leaned over, scanning the last page of their screenplay. 3 months of research, 4 drafts, and countless arguments about the third act. She smiled. "But it's perfect." Meryl sat back, studying their creation with pride. The screenplay, The Highest Court, told the story of a brilliant but overlooked female attorney who rises to become a transformative Supreme Court justice while battling institutional sexism and a personal health crisis. "It's the role I've been waiting for," Meryl said quietly. "A woman in her 60s who changes the course of American law. Not a grandmother, not a witch, not a supporting character, but the heart of the story. And it's based on solid research," Emma added. "Your performance as a judge in that courtroom drama last year really paid off." Meryl nodded. "I spent 3 months studying legal procedures for that role. The director thought I was being excessive, but—" Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "It's from Richard Winters," she said, "head of development at Paramount." Emma gasped. "Already? We just finished it. I mentioned it to my agent last week," Meryl explained, reading the email. "He wants to meet. Tomorrow." The next afternoon, Meryl and Emma sat in a sleek conference room at Paramount Pictures. Richard Winters was tall and polished, with perfect teeth and an overly firm handshake. "Meryl, thanks for coming in," he said warmly. "And Emma, wonderful to meet you." 2 assistants flanked him, tablets in hand, silently taking notes. "What can we do for you, Richard?" Meryl asked, skipping the small talk. "I'll get right to it," Winters replied. "Your agent mentioned your Supreme Court screenplay, and it sounds fascinating. Paramount is looking to develop more sophisticated dramas with strong female leads. Your project could be perfect." Emma glanced at Meryl, barely, containing her excitement. "We'd like to see the full manuscript," Winters continued. "Then we can talk details." "A formal submission through my agent would be standard," Meryl noted. Of course," Winters agreed quickly. "But if you have a copy now, I could start reading this weekend. Speed things up a bit." Later, walking to their car, Emma voiced her concerns. "Shouldn't we wait for a formal submission process? The industry has protocols for a reason." Meryl hesitated. "Richard's respected in the industry, and at my age, opportunities for leading roles are precious. I don't want to waste time if they're genuinely interested." Against Emma's better judgment, Meryl emailed the full screenplay to Winters that evening. Weeks passed with no response. Meryl's calls to Winters went unreturned. Emma tried to hide her growing concern. "These things take time," Meryl assured her, but doubt crept into her voice. Then came the news that shattered everything. "You need to see this," Emma said, bursting into Meryl's home one morning. She thrust her tablet forward, displaying an industry news site. The headline read, "Paramount announces The Justice with Angela Bassett, female Supreme Court drama fast-tracked for production." Meryl read the article, her face draining of color. The plot summary described a story remarkably similar to their screenplay, a brilliant female attorney overcoming institutional barriers to reach the Supreme Court. "This can't be a coincidence," Emma whispered. Meryl immediately called Winters. To her surprise, he answered, "Richard, I just read about The Justice. It sounds remarkably similar to our screenplay." "Meryl," he replied smoothly, "I understand your concern, but this project has been in development for months. Any similarities are coincidental. We received dozens of submissions with similar themes. But the specific elements, her clerk being her former student, the dissenting opinion that changes the majority view, even the heart condition—" "Common dramatic devices," Winters interrupted. "Look, I need to run to a meeting. Have your agent call if you have concerns." The line went dead. After consulting with an entertainment attorney, the news wasn't encouraging. "These cases are extremely difficult to win," the lawyer explained. "Studios have deep pockets and top legal talent. Even with your resources, Ms. Streep, it would be an uphill battle." That evening, Emma found Meryl in her home office, surrounded by law books. "What are you doing?" Emma asked, picking up a volume. "On copyright law." "Research," Meryl replied without looking up. "For a role?" "For a case." Meryl finally met Emma's eyes. "Our case." Emma's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. You're going to sue Paramount? Yourself?" "I am. But you're not a lawyer." "No," Meryl agreed. "But I played a prosecutor in Reasonable Doubt and a family court judge in Final Decisions. I spent months studying law for those roles." "Acting isn't the same as practicing law," Emma protested. "Of course not," Meryl replied calmly. "But I remember everything I learned from my roles. It's how I work. And I've maintained relationships with the legal consultants who helped me prepare." Emma collapsed into a chair. "This is insane. Paramount has an army of attorneys." "Exactly," Meryl said, her eyes gleaming with determination. "And they'll expect me to have an expensive legal team too. They'll prepare for that fight." "But not for you representing yourself," Emma realized slowly. "They'll underestimate me," Meryl continued. "They'll see me as a desperate actress who doesn't know what she's doing. Their arrogance will be their weakness, and you'll use that." "I'll use everything," Meryl said firmly. "What they stole isn't just a screenplay, Emma. It's 2 years of our lives. It's a story that matters." Emma studied her friend's face. "You're really going to do this?" "I am," Meryl confirmed, "but I'll need your help. We need to document every similarity, find anyone at Paramount who might talk, and build a case they won't see coming." Emma hesitated just a moment before nodding. "Where do we start?" Meryl smiled for the first time that day. "We start by letting them think they've won." "You're making a terrible mistake," said Martin Green, Meryl's agent of 20 years. He paced her sunlit living room, agitation visible in every step. "Let me call Sheila Jacobson. She handled that plagiarism case for Spielberg last year. Won a 7-figure settlement." Meryl sat calmly on her sofa, a legal textbook open beside her. "I've made my decision, Martin." "It's career suicide," he exclaimed. "You're Meryl Streep, for God's sake. You don't represent yourself in court against a major studio." "That's exactly why it will work," she replied. "They'll never see it coming." Martin threw his hands up in exasperation. "What they'll see is an easy victory. Victoria Chambers eats plaintiffs for breakfast. She once reduced Robert De Niro to tears in a deposition." Emma entered with a tray of coffee. "Meryl knows what she's doing. With all due respect, Emma, neither of you understands what you're up against. Paramount will bury you in motions, objections, and legal maneuvering." Meryl took a sip of coffee, unruffled by his outburst. "Tell me, Martin, when has underestimation ever been a disadvantage?" He paused. "What?" "In Devil Wears Prada, my character was dismissed as cold and superficial. In Iron Lady, they thought Margaret Thatcher was just a grocer's daughter. Every compelling character I've ever played was underestimated." "Those were roles, Meryl. This is real life. And in real life, people make the same mistake." She closed her book decisively. "Paramount thinks they're facing a desperate actress who's in over her head. I'm giving them exactly what they expect to see." After Martin left, still protesting, Emma turned to Meryl. "He's not entirely wrong. Victoria Chambers has never lost. An intellectual property case. Everyone loses eventually, Meryl replied. Help me with something. She led Emma to her home office, now transformed. One wall was covered with index cards representing a timeline. Another displayed side-by-side comparisons between their screenplay and what little information had been released about the justice. A whiteboard listed potential witnesses and evidence. This is impressive, Emma admitted. When I played Supreme Court Justice Rebecca Blackwell, I worked with Justice Sotomayor's former clerk as my consultant. She's now a copyright attorney at Berkeley. Meryl pointed to a name on the whiteboard. She's been advising me privately. And when you played the prosecutor in Boston? My technical advisor was a former district attorney who taught trial strategy at Harvard. He's helping me prepare my cross-examination techniques. Emma's eyes widened. You've been planning this for weeks. The moment Winters refused to return, my calls, Meryl confirmed. But we need more. We need someone inside Paramount who can confirm they had our screenplay. That's impossible. No one will risk their career. Someone might, Meryl said thoughtfully, if they believe it's the right thing to do. For the next several weeks, Meryl's preparation intensified. She transformed her guest house into a mock courtroom, with Emma playing the role of Victoria Chambers. Each evening, they rehearsed different scenarios: objections, cross-examinations, evidentiary challenges. Your Honor, I object to this line of questioning as irrelevant, Emma declared in her best imperious attorney voice. Objection overruled, replied Martin, reluctantly playing Judge Montgomery after finally accepting Meryl's decision. The witness may answer. Meryl nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Winters, please explain why your development notes from May mention a female Scalia character when you claim never to have read our screenplay that contains precisely such a character. Emma broke character, impressed. That was perfect, firm but not aggressive. Again, Meryl said, let's try the version where he denies everything. Meanwhile, Meryl had been quietly investigating Paramount's history. She discovered 3 previous cases where independent writers claimed the studio had stolen their work. All had settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. Through her network of entertainment contacts, she located a former Paramount script reader named Jason Torres, who had left the company under unclear circumstances. After several unanswered messages, he finally agreed to meet. They sat in a quiet corner of a Venice Beach cafe. Jason was nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. I signed an NDA when I left, he explained. If they find out I'm talking to you, I understand the risk, Meryl assured him. But this isn't just about my screenplay. It's about a pattern of behavior. Jason hesitated, then leaned forward. Winters has a system. When independent projects come in that executives like, they're flagged as inspiration sources. Nothing in writing, of course, but everyone knows what it means. And my screenplay? I wasn't there when yours came in, but I know someone who was. A script reader named Alyssa. She said your screenplay was definitely flagged. Would she testify? Jason shook his head. She's still there, needs the job. But he slid a business card across the table. She might talk to you off the record. As the court date approached, Emma grew increasingly concerned about Meryl's courtroom persona. I understand appearing somewhat inexperienced, she said one evening as they reviewed documents, but you're planning to look completely incompetent. Won't that hurt your credibility with the judge? Meryl looked up from her notes. What's the first rule of acting, Emma? Commitment to the role. Exactly, half measures won't work. Montgomery needs to completely dismiss me as a threat. Chambers needs to feel absolutely secure in her superior position. Meryl's eyes gleamed with intensity. Only then will they make mistakes. And if they don't? They will, Meryl said confidently. People always reveal themselves when they think they're winning. 3 days before the trial, they received an unexpected break. Alyssa, the script reader Jason had mentioned, called Meryl directly. I can't testify, she said without preamble, but check the metadata on the screenplay PDF you sent Winters. Compare the creation date with the first development meeting for The Justice. They're only 4 days apart. The night before the trial, Meryl stood before her bathroom mirror. She practiced looking confused, fumbling with papers, losing her train of thought. all while maintaining that spark of intelligence behind her eyes that only Emma would recognize. "You're ready," Emma said from the doorway. "Almost," Meryl replied. She opened a drawer and removed a pair of reading glasses with slightly smudged lenses. "These will help sell it. I'll constantly clean them. Put them on upside down. Forget. I'm wearing them." "The perfect prop," Emma agreed. "Winters won't know what hit him." "No," Meryl said, her expression hardening momentarily before returning to its practiced vulnerability. "He won't." "The court calls Dr. Lawrence Phillips," Victoria Chambers announced. A thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket approached. The witness stand. After being sworn in, he settled nervously in the chair, adjusting his tie. Judge Montgomery leaned forward with interest. "Please note for the record that Dr. Phillips is a professor of film studies at UCLA and an expert in screenplay analysis." Chambers stood with perfect posture, her voice confident. "Dr. Phillips, could you please explain your qualifications to the court?" "I've been analyzing screenplays for 30 years, Phillips replied. "I've published 3 textbooks on narrative, structure, and consulted for major studios on over 50 intellectual property cases. And you've reviewed both Ms. Streep's screenplay The Highest Court and Paramount's screenplay for The Justice?" "I have," Phillips confirmed, "in great detail." Chambers smiled. "In your expert opinion, are these works substantially similar?" "They share certain broad elements. Both feature female judges reaching the Supreme Court, but the specifics differ significantly. The protagonists have different backgrounds, the supporting characters serve different functions, and the central conflicts resolve through different means." Chambers displayed a slide showing a side-by-side comparison. "Could you elaborate on these differences?" Phillips warmed to his subject. "Ms. Streep's protagonist is a 60-year-old former civil rights attorney with a background in environmental law. Paramount's character is a 50-year-old former prosecutor, specializing in corporate crime. The personal struggles differ as well. One battles heart disease, while the other overcomes a troubled family history." Judge Montgomery nodded, taking notes. He occasionally glanced at Meryl, who appeared to be doodling rather than documenting the testimony. "Ms. Streep," he said sharply, "are you following this testimony?" Meryl looked up, startled. "Yes, Your Honor. Sorry." She fumbled with her glasses, nearly dropping them. The judge sighed audibly before gesturing for Chambers to continue. "Dr. Phillips, based on your analysis, could both works have been created independently?" "Absolutely," Phillips replied confidently. "The similarities represent common tropes in legal dramas. The differences in character, plot, and thematic emphasis demonstrate independent creation. Thank you, Dr. Phillips." Chambers turned toward Meryl with barely concealed satisfaction. "Your witness, Ms. Streep." Meryl approached the witness stand, dropping a pen along the way. The courtroom stirred with barely suppressed amusement. She placed her notes on the podium, then realized her glasses were still on top of her head. "Dr. Phillips," she began, her voice uncertain, "you mentioned tropes that are common in legal dramas. Could you explain what you mean by tropes?" Phillips looked surprised at the basic question. "Tropes are recurring narrative devices. In legal dramas, these include dramatic courtroom confrontations, mentorship relationships, ethical dilemmas, elements audiences expect from the genre." "I see," Meryl said, appearing to take extensive notes. "And in your opinion, a female supreme court justice with a heart condition facing opposition from conservative colleagues is a common trope." "Well, not specifically that combination, but—" "Just yes or no, please," Meryl interrupted, then looked embarrassed. "Sorry, I've seen that in movies." Judge Montgomery suppressed a smile. "This isn't a movie, Ms. Streep. Let the witness answer fully." "The specific combination isn't common," Phillips admitted, "but individual elements appear in various works." Meryl nodded, seeming confused about her next question. She flipped through her notes haphazardly. "In your analysis, did you compare the dialogue between the protagonist and her former law student who becomes her clerk?" Phillips hesitated. "I noted that both works feature a clerk with a prior connection to the judge, yes." "But did you compare the actual dialogue?" Meryl pressed. "I focused more on plot structure and character development. So you didn't notice that 8 exchanges between these characters are nearly identical in both screenplays. Chambers stood quickly. Objection. Ms. Streep is testifying, not questioning. Sustained, Judge Montgomery ruled. Ms. Streep, please confine yourself to questions. Sorry, Your Honor. Meryl fumbled, dropping several papers. As she bent to retrieve them, the courtroom tittered. Let me try again. Dr. Phillips, did Paramount ask you to analyze specific dialogue passages? They asked for a comprehensive analysis, Phillips replied carefully. Yes, but did they direct you to examine specific scenes involving the Clark character? Not specifically, no. Meryl appeared to lose her train of thought. I'm sorry. What was I asking about? More laughter rippled through the courtroom. Judge Montgomery shook his head in dismay. The Clark character, Mrs. Streep, he prompted with thinly veiled impatience. Right, thank you. She turned back to Phillips. One last question. Did Paramount provide you with the complete development history of The Justice? I received what I was told was the complete file, including development notes from before the official green light. Phillips shifted uncomfortably. I don't recall seeing those. No further questions, Meryl said, returning to her seat and nearly tripping over a cable. Emma watched anxiously from the gallery. To untrained eyes, Meryl appeared completely outmatched, but Emma noticed her friend's subtle work, planting seeds of doubt about what Phillips hadn't examined. After the lunch recess, Chambers called Paramount's next witness. The defense calls Sarah Wainwright, head of development for Paramount Pictures. A polished woman in her 40s took the stand. Under Chambers' questioning, she presented a detailed timeline of the Justice Project. Development began in April 2024, Wainwright testified. We have dated concept notes, outline approvals, and budget allocations all preceding Ms. Streep's submission in October. Chambers displayed a series of documents on the courtroom screen. Can you walk us through these development milestones? Certainly. Wainwright pointed to the first document. This concept approval is dated April 18th. Here's the writer assignment. On May 5th. The first draft delivery on July 12th. All before Ms. Streep's screenplay arrived. Judge Montgomery studied the documents with interest. The timeline seems quite clear. When Meryl's turn for cross-examination came, she approached slowly, adjusting her glasses nervously. Ms. Wainwright, who first pitched the concept for The Justice. Richard Winters brought the idea to our creative committee. And where did Mr. Winters get this idea? Objection, Chambers interrupted. Calls for speculation. Sustained, Judge Montgomery ruled. Meryl looked flustered. Let me rephrase. Did Mr. Winters document the origin of his concept? Creative inspirations come from many sources, Wainwright replied smoothly. We don't typically document initial sparks. I see, Meryl said, seeming to struggle with her next question. These development documents, who prepared them? Our production team, following standard protocols. And when were they actually created? Wainwright paused briefly. On or near the dates they bear? Near the dates? Meryl asked, suddenly focused. Not on the exact dates. Our filing system records when documents are entered into the system, which might be a day or two after creation. Or longer, Meryl suggested. Objection, Chambers said, leading the witness. Sustained, Judge Montgomery ruled, looking increasingly weary of Meryl's amateur approach. As the day concluded, the judge addressed both parties. We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. Miss Streep, I strongly suggest you organize your materials more effectively overnight. Yes, Your Honor, Meryl replied meekly, gathering her scattered papers. As the courtroom emptied, Victoria Chambers approached Richard Winters, who had been observing from the gallery. This is going even better than expected, she whispered. She's completely out of her depth. Winters nodded, but something in his expression showed uncertainty. Just make sure Wainwright is better prepared tomorrow. Streep may seem disorganized, but she was asking very specific questions about those dates. Relax, Chambers assured him. By this time tomorrow, Meryl Streep will be begging to settle. After court adjourned, Meryl and Emma hurried through a side exit, avoiding the cluster of entertainment reporters gathered on the courthouse steps. They slipped into a waiting car with tinted windows. That was brutal, Emma said once they were moving. The judge can barely hide his contempt. Meryl removed her reading glasses and straightened her posture. In an instant, the bumbling amateur vanished, replaced by focused determination. "Perfect," she replied. "Did you see Winters fidgeting when I questioned Wainwright about those document dates? He knows something's wrong with their timeline. But their evidence looks solid," Emma worried. "Those development documents predate our submission by months." "On paper, yes." Meryl checked her watch. "We have a meeting in 30 minutes that might change everything." The car pulled up behind a modest coffee shop in Los Feliz, far from the entertainment industry's usual haunts. Inside, a young man with glasses and a nervous expression sat in a corner booth. He stood as they approached. "Miss Streep, I'm Marcus Kim. We spoke on the phone." "Thank you for meeting us, Marcus," Meryl said, shaking his hand. "This is my writing partner, Emma Chen." They settled into the booth, Marcus glancing repeatedly toward the door. "I can't stay long," he said. "If anyone from Paramount sees me talking to you—" "We understand the risk you're taking," Meryl assured him. "You said you read my screenplay?" Marcus nodded. "I was a script reader at Paramount until 3 weeks ago. Your screenplay came across my desk last October. I wrote the coverage report." "Coverage report?" Emma asked. "An internal evaluation," Marcus explained. "We summarize the screenplay and recommend whether it's worth pursuing." He hesitated. "I gave yours the highest possible rating. I said it was Oscar-worthy material with a perfect role for you." "What happened after your report?" Meryl asked. "Usually screenplays get passed up the chain or rejected. Yours disappeared. When I asked about it, my supervisor said it had been flagged for special handling." Meryl and Emma exchanged glances. 2 days later, Marcus continued, there was an urgent meeting of the development team. Winters announced a new priority project, a Supreme Court drama. He distributed a treatment for The Justice and said we needed a finished screenplay in 6 weeks. "And the treatment resembled our screenplay?" Emma asked. "It was your screenplay, just reworked enough to disguise it. Same structure, same character arcs, even similar dialogue in places." "Do you have a copy of this treatment?" Meryl asked. Marcus shook his head. "They're paranoid about leaks. All copies were numbered and collected after the meeting." "Then why should we believe you?" Emma challenged gently. Marcus reached into his messenger bag and removed a small notebook. "Because I keep notes on everything I read. It's how I learn as a writer." He opened to a page filled with neat handwriting. "These are my notes on your screenplay from October." He flipped to another page. "And these are from the meeting about the justice treatment. You can see the similarities yourself." Meryl studied the pages. "This is helpful, but not enough. We need something definitive." Marcus hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's something else. Those development documents they showed in court today? The ones with April and May dates? They were created in October, after your screenplay arrived." Emma leaned forward. "How do you know that?" "Because I was there when Winters ordered their creation. He told the team to backdate everything and create a paper trail. It was all fabricated after they read your submission. Would you testify to this?" Meryl asked. Marcus paled. "I can't. I signed an NDA and I need references for my next job." "I understand," Meryl said. "But would you be willing to sign a sworn statement that I promise wouldn't be used unless absolutely necessary?" After Marcus left with a promised statement, Emma turned to Meryl. "That helps, but it's still his word against theirs." "It's a start," Meryl replied. "Let's see what else we can find." Meanwhile, at Paramount's legal offices, Victoria Chambers was meeting with Richard Winters. "The judge is clearly on our side," she said, pouring herself a celebratory whiskey. "Another day like today and Streep will drop the case." Winters didn't share her confidence. She kept asking about the document creation dates. "So, the dates are consistent with our timeline." "The metadata isn't," Winters admitted. "If she subpoenas the actual files—" Chambers set down her glass. "Are you telling me those documents were created after the fact?" "I didn't say that," Winters backpedaled, "but the files might have been updated or reorganized at some point." "Damn it, Richard. That's the kind of detail you tell your attorney before trial." She paced the office. "How bad is it?" Winters loosened his tie. "The development notes, concept approval, writer assignment, all created after her screenplay arrived." Jesus Christ. Chambers collapsed into her chair. They can check that, you know. Digital forensics can determine exactly when files were created. Not if the files are accidentally corrupted, Winters suggested. It is working on it now. Chambers stared at him. That's tampering with evidence. I can't be part of that. You're already part of it, Winters replied coldly. Just win the damn case. Back at Meryl's home, she and Emma worked late into the night. The dining room table was covered with documents, laptops, and coffee cups. Marcus's testimony is compelling, but not enough, Emma said, rubbing her eyes. We need those original files. We're not getting them, Meryl replied. If Winters is as calculating as I think, those files are already being altered or destroyed. So what's our next move? Meryl smiled. We need to talk to the writer they hired. Jeffrey Blake? He won't talk to us. He's under contract. Everyone. Has their price, Meryl said. Or their pressure point. A quick internet search revealed that Blake had a small production company developing independent films. His passion project, a documentary about indigenous water rights, was seeking funding. Make a call, Meryl instructed. Anonymous philanthropist interested in funding his documentary. Meeting tomorrow. Emma raised an eyebrow. You'd actually fund his documentary? Absolutely, but first I want to know exactly how much original writing he did on the justice. The next morning, before court, Meryl met with her digital forensics expert in a temporary office across from the courthouse. What did you find? She asked. The expert opened his laptop. I analyzed the PDF you sent to Winters. Each digital file contains metadata, hidden information about when it was created, modified, and accessed. The PDF you sent was opened multiple times in the 3 days after you sent it. Can you prove who opened it? Not specifically, but I can prove it was opened on Paramount's server. He showed her a technical report. The PDF was copied to their development server on October 12th. By October 15th, the first documents for the justice appeared in their system. All with falsified creation dates, Meryl mused. Exactly. The metadata doesn't lie. Meryl studied the report. This is exactly what we need. Can you testify about this? That's why you hired me, he replied with a smile. As Meryl gathered her materials, deliberately disorganizing some papers for her courtroom performance, Emma entered with news. Jeffrey Blake agreed to meet this afternoon. Excellent. Meryl adjusted her reading glasses, smudging them slightly. Ready for day 2? Emma nodded. Do you think the judge will ever figure out what you're doing? Eventually, Meryl replied. But by then, it'll be too late for Paramount to recover. Across town, Richard Winters was growing increasingly anxious. He called the head of IT. Were you able to fix the file metadata issue? Sir, I told you yesterday, we can alter the access dates moving forward, but we can't change what's already happened. If they get a forensic expert... Damn it, that's not what I wanted to hear. Winters slammed his phone down. Victoria Chambers watched him with growing concern. We need to settle, she suggested, before this gets worse. No, Winters replied, firmly. Push forward. Streep is floundering in court. The judge thinks she's a joke. We just need to hold the line one more day. Little did he know Meryl Streep was already several moves ahead, and the evidence trail he'd tried to hide was about to become his undoing. The defense calls Richard Winters, head of development at Paramount Pictures, Victoria Chambers announced. Court had reconvened for the second day. Judge Montgomery, looking slightly less impatient with the proceedings, nodded as Winters approached the stand. Immaculately dressed in a navy suit, Winters exuded confidence as he was sworn in. From her seat, Meryl studied him carefully. Today, she had arranged her papers in what appeared to be haphazard piles, but were actually meticulously organized. She dropped her pen once more for good measure, drawing a barely concealed sigh from the judge. Mr. Winters, Chambers began, please explain your role at Paramount. I oversee all creative development, Winters replied smoothly. That includes identifying promising projects, hiring writers, and shepherding films through pre-production. And you were directly involved in developing The Justice? Yes, it was my concept originally. I pitched it to our executive committee in April of last year. Chambers displayed the development timeline again. Could you walk us through how this project evolved? Winters described the development process with practiced ease, pointing to each milestone. His testimony perfectly matched the documents shown in court the previous day. Did you receive Ms. Streep's screenplay? Chambers asked. Yes, in October. By then, our project was already well into development. Did you read her screenplay? I skimmed it briefly, Winters admitted. As a courtesy, since it came from Ms. Streep, but we already had our screenplay in progress. Did you share it with anyone else at Paramount? No, it wasn't relevant to our existing project. Chambers nodded, satisfied. Your witness, Ms. Streep. Judge. Montgomery turned to Meryl, clearly expecting another fumbling performance. Miss Streep, your cross-examination. Meryl approached the podium, dropping several papers along the way. The courtroom stirred with familiar amusement. She took her time arranging her notes, cleaning her glasses, and taking a sip of water. Mr. Winters, she began, her voice surprisingly steady. You testified that the justice was your original concept. Where did you get the idea for a female Supreme Court justice with a heart condition? Winters barely hesitated. Creative ideas come from many sources. I've always been interested in Supreme Court dynamics, and adding a health crisis creates dramatic tension. I see. Meryl shuffled through her notes, seemingly losing her place. And the Clark character, the one who was previously the judge's. Student, was that your idea as well? Yes, it creates a natural mentor relationship. Meryl nodded, appearing to accept his answer. Then she looked up suddenly. Mr. Winters, do you know Marcus Kim? The courtroom remained quiet, but a flicker of alarm crossed Winters' face. I believe he was a junior script reader at Paramount. Was? He left recently. Did Marcus Kim read my screenplay when I submitted it? Winters shifted slightly. I don't track which readers review which submissions. Meryl fumbled through her papers, dropping one. Judge Montgomery sighed audibly. But as she retrieved the paper, something in her demeanor changed, almost imperceptibly. To most, but Emma noticed immediately from the gallery. Mr. Winters, Meryl continued, her voice now clearer and more focused. When did you first access the PDF file of my screenplay that I sent you? Chambers sat up straighter. Objection. Assumes. Facts not in evidence. I'll rephrase, Meryl said quickly. Did you open the PDF file of my screenplay on October 12th of last year? I don't recall the exact date, Winters replied. Did you open it again on October 13th and again on October 14th? Winters frowned. As I said, I skimmed it once as a courtesy. Meryl placed a document on the evidence projector. This is a digital forensics report analyzing the metadata of the PDF file I sent you. It shows the file was accessed multiple times on Paramount's server on those dates. How do you explain that if you only skimmed it once? The courtroom stirred. Judge Montgomery leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Chambers stood immediately. Objection. This report wasn't provided in discovery. Because it was prepared last night, Meryl replied calmly. In response to testimony yesterday. Judge Montgomery studied the situation, suddenly seeing Meryl in a different light. I'll allow it. The witness will answer. Winters composed himself. Other staff may have opened it. I don't monitor server access. Meryl nodded, seemingly accepting this explanation. She turned to retrieve another document, no longer fumbling or disorganized. Her movements were now precise and deliberate. Mr. Winters, you testified that development on the justice began in April of last year. When was the concept approval? Document created? April 18th, as it's dated. Meryl placed another document on the projector. This is a metadata analysis of that file, extracted from Paramount's server through discovery. It shows the file was actually created on October 15th of last year, 3 days after my screenplay was first accessed on your server. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Montgomery banged his gavel. Order, he demanded, now watching Meryl with undisguised interest. Victoria Chambers was on her feet. Objection. We've had no opportunity to verify this analysis. Your own IT department can verify it right now, Meryl suggested. Digital files contain creation dates that can't be altered without leaving evidence of tampering. Ms. Chambers, Judge Montgomery said, is the defense prepared to dispute the technical findings? Chambers conferred hurriedly with her team. One shook his head grimly. We request time to conduct our own analysis, Your Honor, she replied. Granted, we'll address this after lunch. The judge turned to Meryl. "Continue your questioning, Ms. Streep." Meryl nodded, now completely transformed. Gone was the fumbling, uncertain amateur. In her place stood a focused, articulate attorney who knew exactly what she was doing. "Mr. Winters, when did you instruct your team to create backdated development documents for the justice?" "Objection," Chambers shouted. "Counsel is badgering the witness." "I'm not counsel," Meryl replied calmly. "I'm the plaintiff. And the question is relevant to establishing fraud." Judge Montgomery studied Meryl with new eyes. "Overruled. The witness will answer." Winter's composure cracked. "I never instructed anyone to backdate documents." Meryl placed a third document on the projector, a sworn statement. "This affidavit from Marcus Kim states that on October 16th, you called an emergency meeting where you instructed your team to, quote, create a paper trail with April dates for the justice. Is Mr. Kim lying under oath?" The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even Victoria Chambers seemed stunned. "This is absurd," Winters managed. "Kim is a disgruntled former employee." "Who left Paramount 3 weeks ago," Meryl noted, "after he objected to what he called unethical practices regarding my screenplay. Isn't that right?" Winters looked to Chambers for help, but she was frantically reviewing the affidavit. Your Honor," Meryl said, "I have similar metadata analyses for every development document Paramount presented yesterday. All were created in October, after my screenplay was received, not in April or May as they're dated." Judge Montgomery straightened in his chair. "Ms. Chambers, is your client prepared to address these allegations?" Before Chambers could respond, Meryl continued. "And I have one more question for Mr. Winters." She approached the witness stand, no longer the meek, confused woman who had entered the courtroom the day before. Her eyes locked onto Winters with an intensity that made him visibly uncomfortable. "Did you instruct your IT department to alter file metadata yesterday after I began questioning document dates in court?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Montgomery's expression had transformed from condescension to stunned respect as he watched Meryl Streep reveal herself as a formidable legal adversary. For the first time, Victoria Chambers looked genuinely worried. She turned to her client, whose face had gone pale. The trap had been sprung. When court reconvened after lunch, the atmosphere had transformed completely. Gone was the faint amusement at Meryl's expense. Instead, a tense anticipation filled courtroom. 12. Reporters who had been half-dozing now sat alert, fingers poised over keyboards. Judge Montgomery entered, his demeanor noticeably different. He regarded Meryl with new eyes, cautious, evaluating, perhaps even impressed. "Before we continue," he announced, "Defense counsel has requested time to examine the metadata evidence presented this morning." Victoria Chambers stood. "Your Honor, we've consulted with our IT department. While we don't concede the accuracy of Ms. Streep's interpretation, we acknowledge that some file creation dates may not align with the document dates themselves." A murmur swept through the courtroom. "That's quite an acknowledgement, Ms. Chambers," Judge Montgomery noted. "How do you explain this discrepancy?" "Standard industry practice, Your Honor. Ideas are often discussed verbally for months before formal documentation. The dates on the documents reflect when concepts were approved, not when the files were created." Meryl rose calmly. "Your Honor, if I may?" The judge nodded, studying her with newfound interest. "The metadata doesn't just show recent file creation. It shows precise timing that directly contradicts Mr. Winters' testimony. Every development document was created within 1 week after my screenplay was received, not months before, as testified." Judge Montgomery turned to Chambers. "Counselor, we maintain that Paramount's timeline is accurate, regardless of when digital files were created," Chambers insisted, though her usual confidence had diminished. "Very well," the judge said. "Ms. Streep, please call your next witness." Meryl stood, no trace remaining of her previous disorganization. "Your Honor, I call Marcus Kim." Victoria Chambers immediately objected. "So, Your Honor, this witness wasn't on the plaintiff's disclosure list. He became relevant only yesterday," Meryl countered, "when defense witnesses testified about document creation dates." Judge Montgomery considered. "I'll allow it, but keep it focused, Ms. Streep. A young Asian man in a neat but inexpensive suit entered and was sworn in. He looked nervous but determined. "Mr. Kim," Meryl began, "what was your position at Paramount Pictures?" "I was a script reader in the development department for 3 years," Marcus replied, "until 3 weeks ago." "And what were your duties?" "I evaluated submitted screenplays, wrote coverage reports, and participated in development meetings." "Did you read my screenplay, The Highest Court, when it was submitted to Paramount?" "Yes," Marcus confirmed, "in October of last year." "And what was your evaluation?" "I gave it the highest possible recommendation. I called it exceptional material with Oscar potential and perfectly suited for Meryl Streep herself." "What typically happens to positively reviewed screenplays?" "They're passed up the chain for further consideration, to development executives and eventually to Mr. Winters." "What happened with my screenplay?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "It disappeared from the regular review process. When I asked about it, my supervisor said it had been flagged for special handling by Mr. Winters personally." Victoria Chambers stood. "Objection. Hearsay." "Your Honor," Meryl responded, "this goes to the witness's direct knowledge of procedures that were followed or not followed with my screenplay." "I'll allow it," Judge Montgomery ruled. "Continue." "Mr. Kim, what happened after my screenplay was flagged?" 3 days later, there was an emergency development meeting. Mr. Winters announced a new priority project, a Supreme Court drama called The Justice. He distributed a treatment and said we needed a completed screenplay within 6 weeks. "Had you heard of this project before that meeting?" "No, and I attended all regular development meetings." "What struck you about the treatment for The Justice?" Marcus took a deep breath. "It contained the same unique elements as your screenplay. A female justice with a heart condition, a former student serving as clerk, a pivotal dissenting opinion that eventually becomes the majority view. The structure was nearly identical. Did you raise concerns about these similarities?" "I tried to. I asked Mr. Winters if the project was based on your submission. He said it was purely coincidental and that their project had been in development for months." Meryl nodded. "What happened next?" "Mr. Winters asked several of us to stay after the meeting. He said we needed to create a proper development timeline for the project. He specifically instructed us to prepare documents dated from April onward." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Montgomery leaned forward, fully engaged. "Did you participate in creating these backdated documents?" "I was asked to, but I objected. I said it seemed unethical. After that, I was gradually excluded from the Justice Development Team." Victoria Chambers rose again. "Your Honor, this testimony is clearly biased. Mr. Kim left Paramount under circumstances that may have fostered resentment." Judge Montgomery turned to Marcus. "Why did you leave Paramount, Mr. Kim?" "I resigned after being removed from multiple projects. It became clear my career there was over after I questioned the practices surrounding the justice." Meryl produced a document. "Your Honor, this is Mr. Kim's resignation letter, citing ethical concerns specifically about the handling of my screenplay. Paramount accepted this resignation without dispute. As the letter was entered into evidence, Richard Winters whispered urgently to Chambers, who shook her head in response. "Mr. Kim," Meryl continued, "in your professional experience, could the similarities between my screenplay and The Justice be coincidental?" "No," he answered firmly. "The unique elements, character dynamics, and narrative structure are too specific. The timing is also revealing. Their project only materialized immediately after your screenplay was received." Chambers stood for cross-examination, her strategy now defensive rather than dominant. "Mr. Kim, you're an aspiring screenwriter yourself, correct?" "Yes, I am." "So you have a vested interest in cultivating relationships with established talents, like Mrs. Streep?" "Objection," Meryl called. "Counsel is impugning the witness's character without foundation." "Sustained," Judge Montgomery ruled. "Ms. Chambers, focus on relevant facts." Chambers tried again. "Did you personally witness Mr. Winters read Ms. Streep's screenplay?" "No, but I saw him with a copy in his office the day after submission." "That's not what I asked. You have no direct knowledge of what Mr. Winters did or didn't read, correct?" "Correct," Marcus conceded. "And these allegedly backdated documents, did you personally see them being created?" "I saw some being prepared." Not all of them. So your testimony about a systematic effort to backdate all documents is based partly on assumption. It's based on Mr. Winter's direct instructions in my presence. Chambers returned to her seat, unable to significantly damage his credibility. Meryl rose for redirect. Mr. Kim, why are you testifying today? What do you hope to gain? Marcus looked directly at Judge Montgomery. Nothing, Mrs. Streep. I'm risking my career in this industry. But integrity matters in creative work. What happened with your screenplay was wrong. As Marcus stepped down, Judge Montgomery turned to Meryl. Your next witness, Ms. Streep. Your Honor, Meryl replied. I'd like to call Jeffrey Blake. Victoria Chambers looked genuinely surprised. Your Honor, Mr. Blake is the credited screenwriter for The Justice. He's not been served with any subpoena. That won't be necessary, Meryl responded. Mr. Blake has agreed to testify voluntarily. He's waiting outside. Richard Winters went visibly pale. He grabbed Chambers' arm, whispering frantically. Judge Montgomery studied the developing situation with growing interest. Whatever he had initially thought about Meryl Streep's legal abilities, he was now witnessing a masterclass in strategic case building. The court will hear from Mr. Blake, he decided, giving Meryl an approving nod that would have been unimaginable just hours earlier. Jeffrey Blake cut an unassuming figure as he took the stand, mid-40s, with thinning hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He avoided eye contact with the Paramount team, particularly Richard Winters, who stared at him with barely concealed fury. Mr. Blake, Meryl began, you're the credited screenwriter for Paramount's film The Justice, correct? Yes, Blake answered, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. When were you hired to write this screenplay? Officially May of last year, that's when I signed the contract. And when did you actually begin writing? Blake hesitated. October, mid-October. Victoria Chambers shifted in her seat but didn't object. The timeline contradiction was already established. What materials were you given to work from? Meryl continued. Our treatment from Mr. Winters. About 15 pages outlining the story, characters, and major plot points. Did Mr. Winters explain where this treatment came from? He said it was developed in-house over several months. Meryl nodded. Have you subsequently had reason to question that? Yes, Blake replied, glancing at Winters. After reading your screenplay yesterday. The courtroom stirred. Judge Montgomery leaned forward. "Will you read Ms. Streep's screenplay yesterday?" the judge asked directly. "Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Streep's representative contacted me and asked if I would review it. I agreed." "And your conclusion?" Meryl prompted. "The treatment I was given was unmistakably derived from your screenplay. The unique elements, character dynamics, even specific scenes were virtually identical, just with names changed and a few plot points rearranged." Richard Winters whispered urgently to Chambers, who finally stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Blake is not a literary expert, qualified to determine originality." "I'm a professional screenwriter with 20 years' experience," Blake countered. "Recognizing when material is derivative is literally part of my job," Judge Montgomery considered. "The witness may give his professional opinion." "Continue, Ms. Streep." "Thank you." Meryl turned back to Blake. "Did you know your screenplay was based on material taken from another writer?" "No. Had I known, I never would have accepted the assignment." Victoria Chambers rose again. "Your Honor, Mr. Blake's personal ethics aren't relevant here. They speak to intent and knowledge, which are central to this case," Meryl responded. "I'm establishing that Mr. Blake was an unwitting participant in Paramount's scheme." "I'll allow it," Judge Montgomery ruled. "Proceed. Mr. Blake, why are you testifying today? You're still under contract with Paramount, correct?" "Yes. But there are ethical boundaries that matter more than contracts." Blake straightened his shoulders. "Screenwriters like me depend on the integrity of the industry. If studios can simply take original work without consequences, none of our creative rights are safe." After Blake's testimony concluded, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Judge Montgomery called a 15-minute recess. As people filed out, Emma made her way to Meryl. "That was incredible," she whispered. "Blake just destroyed their defense." Meryl nodded slightly. "We're not done yet." When court reconvened, all eyes were on Meryl Streep. Gone completely was the fumbling amateur from day one. In her place stood a commanding presence who moved with precision and spoke with clarity. "Your Honor," she began, "I'd like to address the legal remedy I'm seeking." Judge Montgomery nodded. "Please proceed, Ms. Streep." Meryl approached the bench, a leather-bound book in hand. "This case involves more than standard copyright infringement. The evidence has established that Paramount deliberately misappropriated my work, then created false documentation to cover their actions." She opened the book to a marked page. "I direct the court's attention to the Creative Expression Protection Act of 2017, specifically Section 38B. Victoria Chambers frowned, quickly consulting with her team. One associate frantically searched on his tablet. "This provision," Meryl continued, "addresses cases where infringement is accompanied by willful concealment, falsification of records, or other aggravating factors demonstrating bad faith." Judge Montgomery accepted the book, studying the provision with interest. "I'm familiar with the CPA, but this section is rarely invoked. Because most infringement cases don't involve the level of deception we've seen here," Meryl explained. "The statute provides that in such extraordinary cases, the court may impose enhanced remedies, including disgorgement of all development costs and profits, plus punitive damages up to 3 times the established harm." The Paramount legal team erupted in whispered consultation. Victoria Chambers stood, looking genuinely alarmed. "Your Honor, Ms. Streep is correct that Section 38B exists, but it's an extreme remedy reserved for the most egregious cases. Nothing presented here rises to that level." "With respect," Meryl countered, "the evidence shows Paramount not only stole my screenplay, but created an elaborate false timeline to conceal their actions. They then attempted to alter digital evidence during trial. If this doesn't qualify as egregious, what would?" Judge Montgomery considered this, clearly impressed by Meryl's legal knowledge. "Ms. Chambers, she raises a valid point. The statute specifically mentions falsification of records. Even if the court finds infringement occurred," Chambers argued, "these enhanced penalties would be disproportionate. Standard remedies would be more appropriate." Meryl turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I present a comprehensive analysis of the similarities between the screenplays?" At his nod, she distributed detailed documents to the court. The side-by-side comparison was devastating, highlighting not just similar concepts, but nearly identical dialogue, character traits, and narrative beats. "As you can see," Meryl explained, "this goes far beyond coincidental similarity. Approximately 70% of Paramount's screenplay is directly derived from mine. Not just the premise or general structure, but specific scenes, character dynamics, and even dialogue." Judge Montgomery reviewed the analysis carefully. His expression grew increasingly serious as he turned page after page. "Ms. Chambers," he said finally, "this comparison is troubling." Victoria Chambers recognized the shift in momentum. "Your Honor, we request a recess to consult with our client about potential resolution." 30 minutes, Judge Montgomery agreed. As the courtroom emptied, Richard Winters confronted Chambers in a private conference room. "What the hell just happened?" he demanded. "She outplayed us," Chambers replied bluntly. "That SEPA provision could cost Paramount tens of millions." "No jury would award that," Winters scoffed. "We're not in front of a jury," Chambers reminded him. "We're before Judge Montgomery, who now clearly respects Streep and her case, and frankly, after seeing that comparison, so do I. So we settle." Winters concluded reluctantly. "Immediately," Chambers confirmed, "before she introduces whatever else she has waiting." When court reconvened, Victoria Chambers addressed the bench. "For Your Honor, in the interest of judicial economy, Paramount would like to discuss settlement terms with Ms. Streep." Judge Montgomery turned to Meryl. "Ms. Streep," Meryl stood confidently, "I'm open to discussion, Your Honor, but any resolution must include full screenwriting credit, substantial compensation for the theft of my work, and a formal acknowledgement of what occurred." "The parties will use the remainder of today to negotiate," Judge Montgomery decided. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning to either continue proceedings or finalize a settlement." He looked directly at Meryl. Any trace of his earlier condescension completely vanished. "Miss Streep, I must say your knowledge of copyright law and trial strategy has been unexpected." For the first time in court, Meryl allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you, Your Honor. I've always believed in thorough preparation for any role." As the judge left the bench, Emma rushed to Meryl's side. "You did it. They're ready to settle." "Not quite yet," Meryl replied quietly. "We still have one more card to play." The settlement conference took place in Judge Montgomery's chambers, and by Vice, elegant room with dark wood paneling and walls lined with legal texts. Meryl sat calmly on one side of the conference table, Emma beside her. Across sat Victoria Chambers, Richard Winters, and two Paramount executives who had flown in that morning. Judge Montgomery presided at the head of the table, his manner now respectful toward Meryl. The transformation from his earlier condescension was complete. "Before we begin formal negotiations," the judge said, "I want to be clear about where we stand. The evidence presented strongly suggests Paramount inappropriately used Ms. Streep's screenplay and then created false documentation to conceal this action." Winters shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. "I believe," the judge continued, "that, were this case to proceed, Ms. Streep would likely prevail on her Section 38B claim, which would trigger substantial damages. With that understanding, let's discuss resolution terms." Victoria Chambers opened a leather portfolio. "We're prepared to offer Ms. Streep co-writing credit and $2 million in compensation, contingent upon confidentiality provisions." Meryl smiled. "Slightly. That's not adequate. What do you propose?" one of the executives asked, clearly wanting to conclude this matter quickly. "Full primary writing credit," Meryl replied. $7 million in compensation, no confidentiality provision, and a public acknowledgement from Paramount regarding what occurred." "Completely unreasonable," Winters snapped. "Co-writing credit is generous given the changes we made." "Changes to my original work," Meryl countered. "And as for compensation, the potential Section 38B penalties would exceed $20 million. "I'm being quite reasonable." The executive leaned toward Chambers. "What are our options?" "Limited," Chambers admitted quietly. "The evidence is compelling, and Judge Montgomery seems inclined to apply the enhanced penalties if we proceed." Winters, refusing to concede, tried another approach. "The publicity from a protracted legal battle would hurt both parties. Surely, a private resolution benefits everyone." Meryl shook her head. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Winters. This isn't just about my screenplay. It's about a pattern of behavior that harms writers throughout the industry." She removed a folder from her briefcase. "Which brings me to the final piece of evidence I plan to introduce today." She passed copies to everyone at the table. "These are statements from 3 other writers who experienced similar treatment from Paramount under Mr. Winters' leadership. All had their work reviewed and subsequently saw suspiciously similar projects developed in-house." Judge Montgomery examined the statements with interest. These would be admissible to show pattern and practice. Victoria Chambers quickly reviewed the documents, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Your Honor, these allegations are unrelated to the current case." "On the contrary," Meryl replied, "they establish exactly what Section 38B addresses, a pattern of willful concealment and bad faith in creative appropriation." The Paramount executives whispered urgently to each other. One finally spoke. "Miss Streep, what exactly do you want?" "Justice," she answered simply. "Full writing credit, fair compensation, and assurance this won't happen to other writers." The executive nodded thoughtfully. "May we have the room for a few minutes?" When they returned after a brief private conference, their demeanor had changed. Richard Winters was notably absent. "We can meet your terms," the executive stated. "Full writing credit, $7 million in compensation, and a public statement acknowledging the situation. In exchange, we ask only that the statement be jointly crafted to avoid undue reputational harm." "And Mr. Winters," Meryl inquired, "is no longer leading our development department effective immediately." Judge Montgomery raised an eyebrow. "That was quick." "We take these matters seriously," the executive replied, not quite meeting the judge's gaze. "The evidence Miss Streep presented is compelling." An hour later, the settlement agreement was formalized. Both parties would make a joint announcement. Production on The Justice would continue with Meryl credited as the primary writer. Blake would retain secondary credit for his adaptation work. As they prepared to return to the courtroom to announce the settlement, Judge Montgomery held Meryl back for a moment. "Off the record, Miss Streep," he said quietly. That was one of the most remarkable legal performances I've witnessed in 25 years on the bench. Thank you, Your Honor. I've been wondering, was the initial fumbling act necessary? You clearly knew what you were doing from the start. Meryl smiled. They expected an actress out of her depth, not a prepared adversary. People reveal different weaknesses when they believe they're winning. Judge Montgomery nodded. A psychological strategy, effective if somewhat theatrical. I am an actress after all, Meryl replied with a small smile. In the courtroom, the settlement was formally announced. Judge Montgomery addressed the court. The parties have reached a comprehensive resolution that the court finds fair and equitable. Ms. Streep will receive full writing credit and appropriate compensation. Paramount has acknowledged the similarities between the works and has implemented changes to prevent similar situations in the future. He paused, then added something unplanned. Before we conclude, I wish to address a matter of professional conduct. The courtroom fell silent. When these proceedings began, I made certain assumptions about Ms. Streep's legal abilities based solely on her profession. Those assumptions were unfounded and inappropriate. Ms. Streep has demonstrated exceptional legal acumen, preparation, and strategic thinking throughout this case. He looked directly at Meryl. The court apologizes for any disrespect shown earlier in these proceedings. Meryl nodded in gracious acknowledgement. This matter is resolved. Court is adjourned. As people filed out, reporters rushed forward, shouting questions. Emma helped Meryl navigate through the crowd to a private exit where a car waited. Once inside, Emma finally let her excitement show. You did it! Everything we wanted! We did it, Meryl corrected. Your research was crucial. But that final folder of evidence, those other writers, how did you find them? Martin connected me with one, Meryl explained, referencing her agent. The others came forward after hearing about the case. Apparently Winters had quite a reputation in certain circles. Will they pursue their own cases? They don't need to now. Paramount will be reviewing all questionable projects developed under Winters. The car pulled away from the courthouse, leaving the media frenzy behind. Meryl gazed out the window, finally allowing herself to feel the satisfaction of victory. You know, Emma said after a moment, I initially thought representing yourself was the worst idea ever. Most people did, Meryl agreed. That was the advantage. Judge Montgomery certainly changed his tune. People often do when their assumptions are challenged. Meryl turned from the window. That's what I love about acting, Emma, revealing truth through performance. Today was just a different kind of performance. With real consequences, Emma noted. Winters lost his job. The screenplay is yours again. Meryl nodded. And hopefully, studios will think twice before taking advantage of writers. As the car headed toward Meryl's home, she finally allowed herself to relax. The performance was over, the reviews were in, and justice had prevailed, not just for her, but potentially for countless other writers whose voices deserved to be heard and protected. 3 months after the courthouse drama, Meryl Streep stood on the bustling movie set of The Highest Court, watching as her vision finally came to life. The production had been fast-tracked once the settlement was announced, with Paramount eager to demonstrate their commitment to the project under its original creator. Scene 42, Take 3, called the director. Action! Meryl watched from behind the monitors as the actress playing the Supreme Court Justice delivered a powerful dissenting opinion, words Meryl had written with Emma nearly a year ago. The dialogue flowed exactly as they had imagined it. Emma appeared. At her side, coffee cups in hand. Still feels surreal, doesn't it? Seeing our words exactly as we wrote them. Absolutely, Meryl agreed, accepting the coffee. Ms. Streep, a production assistant approached tentatively. There's a visitor for you. To Meryl's surprise, Judge Harrison Montgomery stood awkwardly at the edge of the set, looking out of place among the cables and equipment. Judge Montgomery, she greeted him, extending her hand. Welcome to our little production. Quite impressive, he replied, taking in the meticulous recreation of the Supreme Court chamber. Thank you for allowing the visit. They moved to a quieter area where they could talk. I've been following the industry fallout from your case, Montgomery said. Quite significant. Indeed, the aftermath of Meryl's victory had rippled through Hollywood. 3 major studios had implemented new screenplay submission protocols with enhanced documentation requirements. The Writers Guild had formed a special committee on intellectual property protection, with Meryl as an honorary advisor. "The changes were overdue," Meryl replied. "Writers have been vulnerable for too long." "I actually came with a proposal," Montgomery said. "UCLA Law has asked me to teach a seminar on intellectual property in entertainment. I'd like you to speak to my students about your experience." Meryl raised an eyebrow. From courtroom adversaries to academic colleagues, life takes interesting turns. "You taught me something important," Montgomery admitted, "about assumptions and perceptions. My students would benefit from hearing your perspective." "I'd be honored," Meryl agreed. 2 weeks later, she found herself standing before a packed lecture hall at UCLA Law School. Students filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. Judge Montgomery had introduced her not as an actress, but as one of the most effective pro se litigants I've encountered in my judicial career. "The law is ultimately about storytelling," Meryl began, "about convincing others to see events from a particular perspective. In that way, it's not so different from acting." For the next hour, she detailed her legal strategy, the careful preparation, the deliberate misdirection, the precise timing of evidence reveal. "I studied my opponents," she explained. "Victoria Chambers had never lost a case against a self-represented plaintiff. Her strategy was always the same: overwhelm them with procedure, intimidate them with expertise, make them feel out of their depth." A student raised her hand. "So you played into her expectations?" "Exactly," Meryl confirmed. "I gave her what she expected to see, an actress floundering in legal procedure. That made her overconfident, less careful. But the legal research," another student asked. "How did you manage that without formal training?" "I had help from legal consultants," Meryl acknowledged. "But much of it came from my preparation for film roles. When I played a prosecutor in Reasonable Doubt, I worked with a former district attorney for months. When I portrayed a family court judge, I observed real cases and studied procedure." She smiled. "Actors are professional researchers. We immerse ourselves in worlds we need to portray." After the lecture, a young woman approached her. "Ms. Streep, your case inspired me. I'm studying entertainment law because of what you accomplished." Meryl recognized something in the student's determined expression. "What's your name?" "Sophia." "Chen. My sister is a screenwriter who had a similar experience with a different studio. They took her concept, but she couldn't afford to fight it." "Is she still writing?" Sophia nodded. "But she's afraid to submit anything." Meryl took out a business card. "Have her call my office. The Writers' Protection Project we established after the case might be able to help." The Writers' Protection Project had been Meryl's first initiative after the settlement. Using part of her compensation, she had established a legal fund to help writers facing similar situations. Already, they were supporting 3 cases against major studios. That evening, Meryl had dinner with Emma at a quiet restaurant in Malibu. They had much to celebrate. The highest court was progressing beautifully, and they had just received approval for their next screenplay. "You've barely touched your wine," Emma observed. "Everything okay?" "Just thinking," Meryl replied. "About Richard Winters." After his abrupt dismissal from Paramount, Winters had largely disappeared from the industry. Rumors suggested he was trying to establish himself as an independent producer, with little success. "He got what he deserved," Emma said firmly. "Yes," Meryl agreed, "but it's not just about one executive. It's about a system that incentivizes taking rather than creating, that values expedience over originality. Which is why the project is so important," Emma reminded her. 3 cases already, with more coming. "And why our new production company matters too." Their newly formed company, Authentic Voices Productions, had a singular mission: to develop and protect original stories, particularly from underrepresented writers. They had already optioned scripts from 4 promising newcomers. As they finished dinner, Meryl's phone buzzed with a news alert. The headline read, "Industry Revolution. Studios adopt Streep standards for screenplay submissions." Emma read over her shoulder and laughed. "The Streep standards? They named submission protocols after you?" Apparently, Meryl said, scanning the article, documented receipt of submissions, transparent development timelines, clear rejection notices, all the things we pushed for. Your court case accomplished more than just winning back our screenplay. That was always the goal, Meryl admitted. Individual justice matters, but systemic change lasts longer. The next morning, Meryl returned to the set of The Highest Court. As she watched the day's filming, a delivery arrived, a package from Judge Montgomery. Inside was a bound copy of her courtroom transcript with a note attached. For your archives, one of the finest performances I've ever witnessed, in court or on screen. Justice was well served. Meryl smiled. From an initial dismissal to genuine respect. Perhaps that was the most satisfying victory of all. As she tucked the transcript into her bag, a young production assistant approached nervously. "Ms. Streep, I was hoping to talk to you about a screenplay I've written." "I'd be happy to," Meryl replied warmly. As they walked together toward her office, Meryl reflected on how her legal battle had transformed into something larger than herself. One performance had changed not just her own circumstances, but potentially the creative landscape for countless writers to come. Some roles, it seemed, extended far beyond the final scene.